Hello and welcome to our first video lecture in this Intro to Sociology course. Obviously I cannot be in class to deliver today's lecture, so what I've decided to do is post this video in this format in an attempt to do two things. The first is to make sure that everyone gets the information from the first part of the class which I would otherwise miss. The second reason is that many of my students have been coming up to me early on this semester and expressing their concern over taking notes in this class. So the goal is to give you a format or demonstrate one way of taking notes. Of course, there are many different ways to take notes, but this will show you one, and the key is organization. Because what you want to do is make sure that when you're taking notes, that everything is organized and it's comprehensive to you, so that when you're studying, you've already got the information there. It's just a matter of going through it and remembering it for our tests. Okay? And of course, through your notes, you can identify quickly areas that you're having problems with or didn't have a complete understanding of during the lecture. So you can go back to the textbook and get more information about those areas. So before we move on to today's topic, which is culture and what culture is, we should finish up our modern social theories. As we didn't get enough time last class, we ran out of time before we were able to fully discuss the anti-race theory. So we're just going to go over those quickly before we move on to culture. Now the first anti-race theory, and again I've written out the race theories a little bit in full beforehand to save time, and we'll go through the culture stuff in this sort of manner of taking notes, so bear with us for a little bit. And again, I stress, if you already have a system of note-taking that works for you, you already know how to take notes well, then I apologize because this may be a little bit dry, but again, hopefully it'll help out some students in the class, so I ask you to please bear with me. So again, critical race theory is the first anti-race theory that we'll discuss, and this theory sort of emerges in the 1980s out of Harvard Law School as a movement where the students are calling on the administration to hire more professors of color, as there, at the time, I think there were only two professors who would have been a racialized minority at the time, and the students are asking for more minority professors to be hired, in the sense that they can get a more well-rounded education from different perspectives at this time. So critical race theory emerges as both a field and a movement out of this movement at Harvard Law School as well, and there are a number of different tenets or principles of critical race theory, which again I have written out here in advance just to save a little bit of time. Now the first tenet or principle of critical race theory is that racism is embedded in American life. So obviously the first element that critical race theorists would try to uncover when doing a sociological study is how racism acts as a vehicle of oppression or subordination, or insubordination at the same time, for many racialized groups in society. So how does the status quo work to oppress and subordinate different groups of people in society to maintain the dominance of one group in society? Critical race theory will also express skepticism towards dominant legal claims of color blindness, neutrality, objectivity, or different claims about political correctness, or that our society can be characterized as a meritocracy. Essentially, critical race theorists will say that racism is institutionalized, and this goes hand in hand with the first tenet, that racism is embedded in American life. So not only is it embedded in American life, but has been institutionalized, which means that it has worked its way into the social institutions developed through social interactions, and thus critical race theory tends to ignore these claims about political correctness and the need for political correctness, because critical race theorists will say that this masks the institutionalization of racism. And thus, if you work towards political correctness and neutrality and colorblindness and these sorts of elements, you're going to completely miss how racism is operationalized in society. The third tenet of critical race theory is that history is important to understanding current trends pertaining to racism. So, for example, if you want to find out why there are there are disadvantages between different minority groups, why, for example, African Americans in America tend to be one of the poorest classes of citizens, while, for example, white citizens tend to have more economic advantages, you have to look at history in order to see how these processes have evolved and began and intertwined themselves into society. Now, the other element too, for example, we mentioned this many times, for example, the justice system. If you want to see why there are so many black men in jail, or if you want to look in Canada, say, why are there more Aboriginals in prison than any other racialized group? You have to look at history to do this. Any theory that is ahistorical, that is, that it does not account for historical processes, would not be able to understand these racialized structures and forms of oppression. So again, history is very important to understand how racism is institutionalized and operationalized in our society. The fourth trend is that experience is important to understanding racism. So again, just like many other post-structuralist theorists, experiential knowledge, that is, going directly to those who experience these forms of racism and trying to understand their perspective, this is one of the most important things to being able to understand how racism acts in our society and is influenced or influences different people and groups in society. So again, experiential knowledge. If you want to find out how, for example, Cambodian immigrants experience life in America and the racial structures, for example, then you want to go directly to these Cambodian immigrants and you want to get their experiences. Okay. The overarching approach to critical race theory is interdisciplinary and intersectional. So critical race theorists will draw on many different perspectives. They'll look at post-structuralist thought, they'll take Marxism, feminism, liberalism, and they'll try and use all of these different analytical tools to uncover the operation of racism in society. So we're using interdisciplinary and intersectional approaches, and we're not just sticking to one specific discipline and attempting to analyze racial structures from that. We want to go broader in order to experience how different fields are understanding and unwinding these structures in our society. So the larger goal of critical race theory is to end all oppression. So they do this first off by trying to understand racial structures as a goal of eliminating racial oppression, and thus through this exercise other forms of oppression can also be uncovered and eliminated. That is the goal of critical race theory. Okay, so these tenets form the basis of critical race theory, and again, it is used by many scholars to uncover many structures of racial oppression and subordination in our society. So the next guy that we'll talk about is a scholar by the name of Richard Dyer, and Richard Dyer has written a book where he is theorizing whiteness. His book is called White, and I should probably write that in here. And essentially what Richard Dyer is saying is he's building on this post-structuralist idea of othering or normalization, where one, there's a binary opposition constructed, a false dichotomy if you will, and one of these is considered normal, while the other is considered abnormal. So Richard Dyer suggests that white or whites are thought of as simply people, while non-whites are thought of as distinct races. Okay, so there is the dominant, the normal, that is white, and there is the other, or the abnormal, and those are the other races, if you will. So different people of color have to be racialized. And one example of this is, if you remember President Obama's campaign, how the media constantly portrayed him as black President Obama or black Senator Obama when he was running. However, his opposition, Republican candidate John McCain, was just Senator John McCain. Of course, John McCain is a white senator, but again, that's not coming through in the media. What is coming through is the white is normal, so just Senator McCain, while the other races are abnormal or are thought of as distinct races. Black President Obama. Okay, black Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, black General Colin Powell. Okay, so race is always thrown out, and this is this process of othering, which Richard Dyer is attempting to point out. So essentially, we are de-racializing whiteness. Okay, so Richard Dyer would say that whiteness carries privilege in our society. So there's a hidden assumption in there that white represents the human race. In fact, here's a bit of a quote from Richard Dyer. He says that white people have power and believe they think, feel, and act like and for all people. White people set standards of humanity by which they are bound to succeed and others bound to fail. White power, nonetheless, reproduces itself regardless of intention because it is not seen as whiteness, but as normal. Okay, so if we wanted to write that in there, white seen as normal constantly reproduces white power, or white power constantly reproduces itself. Okay? So those are two anti-race theorists. There are, of course, numerous anti-race theories, and I should probably drop that down a little bit so it's more visible. These are two of them, and of course they will draw on many other different theories: feminism, post-structuralism, colonialism, if you will, or post-colonial thought. Okay, and all these different theories work into anti-race theory to try and uncover these structures of racial oppression and subordination in an attempt to try and end these structures in our society. So that concludes our modern social theories, and at this point we are going to move on to today's focus, which is culture, which I guess I have written in here as well. So culture is the focus. What we are trying to uncover here is what is culture, what are the dominant areas, or how culture is formed, what makes up culture. So our first, let me just drop the screen down slightly here to make this a little bit more visible. Alright, we'll start over here. So, our first question that we have to address is, what is culture? Now, culture is a complex collection of values, beliefs, behaviors, and material objects. Now, these are shared by a group within a specific culture, and they're passed from one generation to another. Now, the key to understanding culture, and we'll get a little bit more into this a little bit later in this lecture, is that it is both material and immaterial factors that are a part of culture. So first of all, just to give you a better understanding of what these are, material, and we've talked about this a lot, is physical objects or goods that are produced or exist in a society. Okay, so anything that you can touch, a tangible object. And I'm just need to adjust the perspective on this screen here because it seems to be falling apart very quickly. Okay. And the immaterial factors are the exact opposite. So intangible objects, things you can't see or touch, they exist within the social mind of the group. This is very similar to Durkheim and his idea of the collective conscience. Remember, we couldn't touch that, couldn't see it. You had to study it by looking at social facts. Okay, so we're going to break down a little bit later in the lecture what these immaterial or intangible aspects of culture are. But again, just to be clear, culture is a complex collection of values, beliefs, behaviors, and material objects that are shared by one social group, and they're passed down from one generation to another. They exist outside, I guess, of individuals. It's a collective collection of ideas, norms, values, and beliefs. So sociologists will generally suggest that there are 5 defining features of culture. The first is that culture is learned. No one is born cultured. You learn culture through being immersed in social relations. So the first group that you probably are likely to learn the cultural codes of conduct and ways of behaving and the various aspects that have value in that society is through interacting with your parents. And again, I feel like I'm losing the zoom in on this for some reason. Maybe too much enthusiasm on the keyboard. So the parents are the first group that you will learn many of these norms and beliefs that pervade culture. And then once you move out into junior kindergarten and school, and then you meet your friends and other different structures that you associate and groups that you associate with, you are more inclined to learn what the culture is of that society. I think we should probably boost this computer screen up slightly so that we can see what's going on down here. I think we have solved the problem. Okay, so your parents, you got your schools, the political structure, the economic, these sorts of things. Okay, so functioning in these atmospheres, you are likely to learn the culture in which you are immersed in. No one, again, is born cultured. Okay, so culture, as you learn it, will modify your perception of the world. So how you see the world, what are the values of that specific culture, the perspective with which you approach the world, all these things are learned. And there's a cool German word they use to describe this in terms of developing one individual's worldview as a result of the cultural immersion that that person experiences. Now this word is Weltanschauung. It's a very bizarre spelled word, of course, but it is German, as I mentioned. Okay, and essentially what Weltanschauung is, instead of saying specifically worldview, it gets a little bit more specific. It's a comprehensive comprehension or apprehension of the world from a specific historical standpoint. Okay, so a Weltanschauung or worldview is what an individual would develop from being completely immersed in the social structures of their day. And the worldview and the perception of the world which they develop from this can be described as the Weltanschauung, all right, the worldview. So how you dress, how you eat, how you socialize with the people around you. This is all learned and becomes ingrained in the individual's social structure with how they interact with society. The second element of culture is that culture is shared. And this again is the second defining feature of culture. So being shared, this means that culture develops out of interactions and shared experiences. Okay, and through these interactions and shared experience, we develop meanings about the world around us and an understanding. So as we are sharing culture, this also has the result of producing group cohesion, if you will. It helps maintain solidarity within a specific culture. So specific ways in Canada, how we maintain a shared culture, develop a shared culture. For example, could be cheering for a national hockey team. Right? The world seems to stop as soon as, the Canadian juniors or the Canadian national team is playing hockey in Canada. This is a defining feature that builds solidarity amongst Canadians. Another thing might be Tim Hortons. If you want to look at why Tim Hortons is fully ingrained, so to speak, in the Canadian psyche, or why they have trouble breaking into America and having as much success in business terms they do in Canadian, you have to look at Canadian culture and the shared history. For some reason, everybody likes getting a bad cup of coffee from Tim Hortons. Okay, and this has become a part of our culture to a certain extent. And of course, Tim